Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's virtual forum event hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of you as Geopolitics. My name is Shelby Benz, and I am a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service studying Science, Technology, and International Affairs and Spanish. During my time at Georgetown, I have had so many amazing opportunities to immerse myself in the world of public service, such as being here today with all of you. It has been a distinct privilege of mine to serve as one of the student leaders of GU Votes, the student-led initiative working to enhance voting culture and to increase civic engagement within our community through simplifying the voter process, increasing turnout rates, and integrating voter registration into the university ecosystem. If you still need to register to vote or request your absentee ballot, please visit bit.ly/GUVotes. Our voting portal is your one-stop shop for being engaged and informed this election season. I am pleased to introduce our panelists today. Michael Chertoff served as the second Secretary of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009 and is currently a member of the National Task Force on Election Crises. Jay Johnson served as the fourth Secretary of Homeland Security from 2013 to 2017 and is currently a partner at Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison. Please join the conversation on social media using the hashtag GUVirtualForum and by tagging Geopolitics at Geopolitics. Today's event will be moderated by Geopolitics Executive Director Mo Alithi, who is going to kick us off.
Shelby, thanks so much for the introduction. More importantly, thank you so much for your leadership and all the work you and the rest of the GU Votes team is doing. If you're not familiar with GU Votes and you're a member of the Georgetown community, you ought to be. They have done incredible work to enhance the voting culture at Georgetown, increasing student voter participation by about 140%, I think, over the last two elections. So it's really important, tremendous work they're doing. And that's sort of what we're going to be talking about today, right? The voting culture and the integrity of our electoral process. We all know there's a lot of anxiety about it right now. We're going to focus on one of those reasons why there's some anxiety with two public servants who know a lot about it and have had to address it and are continuing to share with the public their thoughts on it. I'll bring them into the conversation momentarily, but the way today is going to work is for the first half of the conversation, I will lead a discussion with both secretaries, and then we're going to invite you in to ask your own questions directly of them. If you are a member of the Georgetown community here in the Zoom, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Click that. You can click it at any point, beginning now. Begin to populate your questions, and then at some point, someone from the team will let you know. When we're ready for you to ask your question, you will appear on screen so you can ask it of our guests directly. So we know a few things about what happened in 2016. We know that the Russians hacked into the campaigns, or at least one of the campaigns, and into one of the National Party headquarters. We know that they attempted, to varying levels of success, to infiltrate actual voting systems. And we know that they ran a very sophisticated misinformation, disinformation campaign. That was 4 years ago. Just a few weeks ago, the intelligence community released a report saying that it's not just the Russians, that the Chinese and the Iranians are also showing some activity, if not using all the same techniques, but some techniques that we saw in 2016. And so I'm thrilled to be joined by Secretary Johnson, Secretary Chertoff today to talk about this issue of foreign interference in our elections, how to make our elections more secure, not just for the election we're in the middle of now, but moving forward. And I was hoping, Secretary Johnson, that we could start with you. You were there in 2016 at the Department of Homeland Security. You were witnessing a lot of this happening in real time and helping to think through what the federal response should be in real time. I'm wondering if maybe you can talk a little bit about what you were seeing on the ground in 2016 and lessons to be learned immediately after that experience.
Sure thing. Thanks for inviting me and Mike. Mike and I have been together a lot lately in the run-up to the election, talking about this topic and related topics. We even had dinner with our wives last weekend in Morristown, New Jersey, in case we weren't getting enough FaceTime together. Mike and I are very, very good friends. I also would like to mention that my wife is a graduate of the Georgetown Dental School. Yes, at one point there was a dental school at Georgetown. My father-in-law went there as well. Amazingly, she still gets fundraising letters, even though the school has been closed for years. So, hats off to the development people at Georgetown University. Mo, you divided the threats into the three categories that I often divide the threats into. You described it pretty much the way I have described it. There was the direct threat to our election infrastructure and the possibility of a cyber attack on voter registration list and the like, which in 2016 was the thing that concerned me the most, given what we were seeing in the intelligence picture and given that I was in a position to volunteer our assistance to state election officials to do something about it. Bucket two were the hacks into the DNC and weaponizing the information that was stolen from the DNC and from other sources. And then bucket three was the larger, vast effort at disinformation, fake news, and the like. And on October 7th, 2016, which was exactly 4 years ago, 2 days ago, when the DNI issued our public statement formally accusing the Russian government of hacking into our election infrastructure and trying to influence our democracy, we knew about the hacks into the DNC, and we knew that the Russian government, authorized at the highest levels, was doing exactly that. By October 7, 2016, that picture was clear. In the second paragraph of that statement, I felt very strongly that we should say something about our election infrastructure as well. At that moment, we were not in a position to say it was the Russian government. So I think we said it was coming from a Russian platform. And then the third category, the disinformation category, which was vast, we were not in a position to fully explain it and disclose it to the American public. And it wasn't for a very long time after that I think we as a government have understood the full extent of it. And it's laid out in very specific terms in the Mueller indictment. But at that time, we were wrestling with the hacks into the DNC and the threat of infiltration into our election infrastructure. And we were, at the time, reluctant to step into this realm of a very heated campaign where one candidate was saying that the election was going to be rigged. But we felt what we had to tell the American public what we knew at the time. The other thing I'd like to add, I'm sorry, Mo, the other thing I'd like to add to that is the Russians, and I'm sure we'll get into this, are still very much at this. You alluded to this, but it should not discourage anyone from voting. It should not discourage anyone from participating in our democracy. I believe that there is a civic obligation among voters, among those eligible to vote, to be smart about their vote and to pierce through the disinformation out there on social media and be a smart voter.
Secretary Chertoff, I know you've been echoing that point, and the two of you, as well as some of the other former secretaries, have been out there very aggressively pushing the message that our election system is safe. It is that encouraging people to vote, and that the best way actually to combat some of this foreign interference is by exercising your right to vote And I'm glad you are. I think that's an important message for everybody to hear. But I'd like to kind of look at a couple of the buckets that we've talked about, and just, again, not just lessons learned, but a path forward. And I'd like to start actually with the election systems, and sort of answer that, ask you that question: how secure is our election infrastructure?
I would say that, Mo, that, well, first let me echo what Jay said about everybody voting. That's really important. I think the actual voting process is pretty immune from being hacked. First of all, obviously paper ballots can't be hacked. And even ballots that are entered electronically, first of all, many jurisdictions, if not all, have a backup paper system. And also the machines tend to not be connected to the internet except very, very briefly. So it would not be easy to try to actually alter the votes. What is more of a risk is the possibility of hacking into the system that counts and tabulates, but even more than that, the registration system. So if you go to the polls, you have to identify yourself and say who you are, and they look to make sure you're registered. And that works if you have a database, but if, for example, a ransomware attack were launched against a database in a particular state, all of a sudden it would be inaccessible. So one of the things I recommend is if you are running an election registration system, you need to have a backup database that is not always connected to the internet that you could deploy if there was a ransomware attack on your principal registration database. Or you might even want to back it up with paper. So that's where I think in terms of the actual voting infrastructure is where the risk is.
So one of the challenges, though, I would suspect is, we do not have any sort of national election system, right? I mean, we have 50 different state election systems, and even sometimes within a state, different jurisdictions do things a little bit differently. So if someone, an outside agitator who wanted to stir this up using, sort of in this bucket, doesn't need to affect an entire system. They just need to affect a couple of counties in a system, right? So my question is, how big of a challenge does that create for those whose job it is to protect the integrity of the process? Should we have some sort of a national system, or what sort of steps should local officials take if not?
So I think there's actually a positive as well as a negative to the way we distribute the authorities here. The positive is it's very difficult to attack enough polling locations to scale in the way you'd have to for a national election. And because everything is a little bit different, you can't use a cookie cutter. The downside is you have different levels of capability. And one of the things that
it looks like he's having some connectivity issue. Secretary Johnson, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Yeah. A couple of things. One, given the way our politics work, given the Electoral College, a national election result can be altered by upsetting the voting in just a few key precincts in a few key states. That is a vulnerability. That is not necessarily a cyber vulnerability. There are things one could do or have attempted in the past to do to suppress the turnout in particular precincts in key states. So our election results on a national level do dance on the head of a pin because we insist upon running our elections on a local level, and we insist upon maintaining the Electoral College. And just given our politics, where elections are decided in a few key swing states. So that is a vulnerability. I saw this up close and personal in 2016 when I was encouraging state election officials to seek our cybersecurity assistance at the federal level. And I got a lot of pushback to simply designating election infrastructure as critical infrastructure, because a lot of state election officials saw it as the first move toward a federal takeover of the system, binding operational directives and such. And many of them, at least the ones that gave voice to their objections, said, this is our province. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. Stay out of the system. But the reality is there are, unlike a whole lot of other areas crucial to our democracy, crucial to public safety and the like, there are very, very few federal standards for how you run a federal election, state by state. And so we have this hodgepodge, as you and I were talking, Mo, about dates for when they will start counting balloting, when they will stop counting mail-in balloting, and so forth. So it is a state by state thing. I neglected to answer the last part of your first question, which is what is the path forward? The lesson learned in 2016, in my judgment, and this is true across the cybersecurity spectrum, when you're dealing with a nation state, there is no 100% foolproof line of defense to cybersecurity. You have to create sufficient deterrence to make the behavior cost prohibitive for the nation state. All nation states, if they are rational actors, whether they're democracies or communist or dictatorships, behave in a certain way. And if you make the behavior cost prohibitive, then they will stop, which we have yet to do, obviously, if we believe our intelligence community.
So just before we move on to sort of the next bucket, I am curious on this issue of protecting our infrastructure. I know there have been some efforts in Congress to try to get some legislation through to provide additional support to states on this issue. Politics has sort of gotten in the way, as it often does. I am wondering if you were to be advising the federal government now, our legislators now, are there specific steps that you would encourage to help secure our infrastructure a little bit more?
I think what I would do is, first of all, again, make sure we have a fallback position with respect to the registration databases. I would make sure that to the extent we have to transmit results from each polling place to a central area, that we can protect the central database as well as the infrastructure. And I think, frankly, training and technical assistance on the kinds of things that might be vulnerabilities would be worth it.
Okay.
Draw an analogy to how we pay our taxes in this country. To pay your state taxes, you fill out a state tax return, state and local tax return. To pay your federal taxes, you fill out a federal return. And there are rules and standards for both. Imagine if we tried to collect federal taxes dependent upon state tax officials. We don't do it that way. Each government has its own system for collecting its taxes and ensuring its revenue to function. We don't do it that way when it comes to elections, which leads to the results that we have, that we're facing in a couple of weeks. I agree with Mike. There should be some sort of standards. The Senate Intelligence Committee tried to grapple with this when they issued their report on Russia, and you could see the political divide. The more conservatives in the spectrum tended to want to defer to the states, and others were more willing to try to regulate some minimal federal standards for the security around our balloting and around our elections. So it's a tough subject, but we've done this in other contexts, and I think we can do a better job here.
Okay. I want to talk briefly about the one of the other buckets that we laid out earlier, and that was the foreign, the hacking of the DNC. And look, it's not the first time that it's happened. A lot of people don't remember that in 2012, Mitt Romney's campaign was hacked by the Chinese. We did an event with his campaign manager a couple of years ago, and he joked. He said, when they hacked us, they just went rooting around and looking at our policy papers, and we were happy that someone was reading our policy papers. But the notion of sort of political espionage is certainly not new. I'm wondering if there is, if you guys have any thoughts on that, and if there is anything that we can learn about how to better secure our campaigns and our parties, and what role that plays in this process.
Yes, there is something better to do. And in my observation, the campaigns are kind of all over the place, depending upon how big they are, their level of sophistication. Mike and I are both on the board of advisors of something called U.S. Cyberdome, which is a 501c4 that has been offering its cybersecurity expertise on a free basis to campaigns on a bipartisan basis. There are some things that campaigns can do to get a lot smarter about their cybersecurity. You're absolutely correct that hacking into campaigns, attempts at hacking into transition teams is not new. This is traditional behavior in espionage. What was new in 2016 is they stole the information and weaponized it in order to try to influence the outcome.
Secretary Chertoff, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think we've had hacking for espionage purposes for years in prior campaigns, but this was the first time it was actually deployed to put things out and to time it in such a way that it would damage one party.
We had Senator Mark Warner on campus right before the 2018 midterms to talk about some of these issues. He, of course, as everyone knows, is vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And when we were talking about this point, he said, I think it just underscores, beyond just election security, it underscores how sophisticated our foreign actors have gotten in recognizing the role of cyber just as a new battleground, as the new front. And that it might need to prod our government to reevaluate some of how it prioritizes our defense budget, and that sort of your traditional weaponry that we invest in doesn't help in combating these type of cyber attacks. And I think this issue, right, I think just illustrates how sophisticated they've gotten, right?
So there are a lot of agencies of our federal government that are playing in this space. The Department of Defense through Cyber Command, NSA, the Department of Homeland Security through CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the United States Secret Service, the Department of Justice, the FBI. We could use some deconflicting there, but there are a lot of agencies already in this space. The way I looked at it when I was in office, and the way I'd like to still look at it, is the FBI, law enforcement, are the cops, and DHS is the firemen. The cops deal with the threat response, and DHS deals with the asset response. They're the cops, we're the firemen. They address the crime, we put out the fire domestically. And then, of course, you have our offensive capabilities and the like. But there are a lot of people playing in this space right now.
Secretary Chertoff, I want to turn to the third and maybe one of the more complicated pieces of this, and that's the misinformation, disinformation part. Before we do, I just want to remind students, you can begin to submit your questions. We're going to turn to questions soon. Just go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and submit your question, and someone will tap you when it's time. But it seems to me, Mr. Secretary, that the sophistication of the misinformation and disinformation, right? Secretary Johnson talked about the weaponizing of the information that they stole from the campaign servers or the DNC servers. But separate from that, it's the stuff that they're just making up and putting out there and using social media to push, which then ends up getting amplified in some cases by the mainstream media. Talk a little bit about that dynamic and what are some strategies we can employ to combat that?
So let me begin by saying that I think it's actually gotten to the point that it's almost backwards, meaning much of the most inflammatory content is domestically generated. All the Russians do is sit back, watch, pick the things that they think are most outrageous, but they also have to sound believable. It can't be too outlandish. And then they amplify it using various tools that can manipulate the algorithms to raise popularity or to make people believe that their friends are liking something, so they look at it too. But to be blunt, we have domestic politicians who are quite capable of generating huge amounts of disinformation. And in some ways, the Russians can sit back and just watch and chuckle. And this is not necessarily a new phenomenon, because if you go back to the Cold War, there were times when Americans were communist sympathizers, and some of them were called useful idiots, and they would propagate, pro-Soviet propaganda. But honestly, I have to say, I think it's gotten to the point this year, well beyond anything in my experience, in terms of the generating of false stories and also inflammatory stories. They're not always totally made up. Most disinformation has a germ of truth. It's the context, it's the emphasis, and it's the velocity that really makes it weaponized. So I think we are now in an age when we have to look domestically as the generator of some of the most outrageous disinformation.
Mike is absolutely right about the current threat environment. There's so much misinformation, outlandish accusations, fake news that is being generated domestically that the Russians simply have to sit back and just merely aid and abet the republication of this stuff. Well, when it comes to state actors, I go back to what I said earlier. You have to create a sufficient deterrent to get them to stop the bad behavior, which we have yet to do. There's another point here that I think is worth mentioning, which is you mentioned the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians earlier. If you read the intelligence assessments carefully, a lot of what the Iranians and the Chinese are doing is the more traditional efforts at influencing public opinion generally, reacting publicly to policies directed at them that they don't like, which governments do all the time. And that is not to be confused with the covert effort directed specifically at an election, at a vote, targeting specific voters in specific states, weaponizing hacked information and the like. And so the intelligence assessments we've seen that bring China and Iran into the picture do a disservice, in a sense, by muddying those waters. And I kind of smell a political agenda to that, because the Russians clearly favor Trump, while the Chinese may also favor Trump, and the intelligence assessments say the Iranians favor Biden. So I smell a bit of a political agenda there, but it muddies the waters somewhat.
I'm curious, a lot is being said right now about how the social media platforms themselves are addressing some of these issues. And every day they're putting out new information, right? Twitter just announced today that they were going to start flagging some misinformation, trying to make it harder for people to retweet misinformation. Facebook yesterday saying that it was going to start further limit political advertising on election night. But I'm curious your thoughts on sort of the role of the platforms themselves in combating this, and are they being good partners with the federal government in trying to address some of these issues?
So, I think they're struggling with, on the one hand, they want to have their users feel that they have the right to speak and also read things that might interest them. On the other hand, I think increasingly they recognize that there's a line between trying to persuade someone and trying to mislead them and manipulate them so they don't wind up going to the polls or they wind up thinking the elections are being stolen. The easy things to do are not allow foreigners or people with false identities to post things or to buy ads. and also, frankly, to address automated behavior that attempts to affect the algorithms by making things seem more popular than they really are. On the issue of content, that gets a little harder, but I think more and more, because they actually, essentially the platforms are like editorial boards, they can make their own decisions. I think they're beginning to move to the idea that they will not allow postings that either mislead people about how to vote or mislead people about the results coming in. So those are positive steps, and I understand it's a delicate situation. I do have to say something else, though. We often forget that the mainstream media is also culpable in this too. Increasingly, whether it's talk radio or cable television, the drive to get people to click on something because it produces advertising revenue causes many of these new, quote, mainstream news organs or even the talk radio to deliberately take inflammatory positions and hype what's going on, because what they've come to realize is what any behavioral psychologist will tell you. When you frighten people or make them angry, you get their attention. And the economic key to the media is getting attention. So I do think, we need to have professionalism restored to mainstream media. The print media tends to be, by and large, the most responsible. But the truth is, many people get the most misleading disinformation from turning on their favorite cable news channel.
I agree with Mike's assessment, 100%. I find myself falling into the same trap in the evenings when I come home from work. I turn on my favorite cable news show. Interestingly, while I was in office and I was done with national events for the day, I would turn on antenna TV, 70s and 60s sitcoms, because I didn't want to have to think too hard. And I didn't need anything more to make me angry. Social media is a tough problem because once you go down the road of permitting political debate, political advertising, it's difficult to find where to draw the line without being accused of one double standard or another. The one thing that I'm clear about that we should not do is to try to have the government regulate what appears on social media. In this country, the government does not and should not regulate the content of speech or political debate. In other countries, they do that, but that's not a road we can go down in this country, particularly the security agencies of our government. Imagine the power that certain people would have in government if they could deem something fake news and ban it as a result.
I want to turn to some student questions in a moment, but before we do, the whole purpose of this conversation today is to talk about preventing foreign interference in our elections. But I think we're increasingly seeing some domestic groups adopt some of the same techniques and tactics. We saw it begin to play out to its extreme with the story that came out of Michigan yesterday, with the government thankfully thwarting an attempt by a domestic terror group to kidnap the governor of Michigan. That's an extreme, but we see a lot of the same misinformation that is that we've put a huge spotlight on from foreign entities. We see the same sort of thing starting to come up more and more from domestic entities. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, on any sort of domestic issue.
If I could, let me read to you from an op-ed I wrote a year and a half ago. Leaders do lead and Americans do follow the examples and standards their leaders set. A downward spiral in the rhetoric of our leaders lowers the bar for all the rest of us, makes the previously intolerable tolerable, and for the dangerously deranged few who lurk in our society, makes violence inevitable. So we got a taste of that yesterday. And fortunately, through the good work of the FBI and the Michigan law enforcement authorities, anything bad was prevented. But that's not always going to be the case. We're not always going to be that lucky. In almost every context in my lifetime up to now, in an environment like this, we could count on our national leaders to denounce and condemn that type of behavior. in front of the entire American public. I still remember George H.W. Bush, and Mike will remember this, and you'll remember this too, Mo, when David Duke won his party's nomination for governor of Louisiana. Bush went out on the south lawn of the White House to endorse the Democrat because he saw what that represented. We can't count on that anymore from our national leaders. And that is why when people ask me, what do you worry about now? I worry about the climate that is being set where people like those who were arrested yesterday at some level feel emboldened and supported in what they are doing.
That is very true. And let me say this. I think this is going to be particularly an issue in the post-November 3rd period, unless it's an overwhelming result one way or the other. But even if Joe Biden wins, I don't think this problem is going to go away. I remember, as you all do probably, Oklahoma City. And that terrorist attack, in part was the escalation of increasing right-wing extremism over the earlier years when Bill Clinton was elected president. And then finally, when this horrible bombing by McVeigh was carried out, there was kind of a revulsion. And at least for a while, the right-wing extremists kind of put their heads down because everyone was really offended that they killed children. But I think we're back to where we were then. And to be honest, ironically, because I came into DHS when global jihadism was the big terrorist threat, I have to say, I think right now, in terms of people in the U.S., domestic extremist right-wing terrorism is the bigger threat.
Okay, we're going to start taking some questions from members of the Georgetown community. When I introduce you, or when I call your name, please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, your school, year, Georgetown affiliation, where you're Zooming in from. So first up, we've got a question from Tyler.
Hi there, my name is Tyler Van Patten. I'm a sophomore in the college, Zooming from Wisconsin right now. And my question for you is, do you see a future in which disinformation or misinformation campaigns by foreign governments are not a serious concern for the integrity of our elections? And if so, what does that future look like?
Yes, I do. I believe that at some point, our government will create sufficient deterrence so that foreign governments discontinue the bad behavior and move on to something else. I used to tell people at DHS, don't plan for the last attack, plan for the next attack, because the threat streams are continually evolving. I believe that eventually the bad actors will move on to something else. There'll be some different type of threat. I also think the public has to have a role to play here. The public has to accept responsibility for discerning some of the junk they consume and recognizing it as such. So it can't all be on our government to sort out in a free and open society what Americans read and consume and what they should take seriously. The public has to accept some responsibility here too. And if we do that, then we go a long way from insulating ourselves from this type of threat and this type of vulnerability.
Secretary Chertoff, did you want to?
I agree, and I think part of this is going to be education. Our educational system has to, at an early age, start to, just as we teach children, about online predators and not accepting rides from strangers, we need to teach even children, begin the process of educating them about how do you validate whether something is real or exaggerated or false.
Tyler, thanks for the question. Next up, we've got Eva.
Hi, thank you to you both for being here. My name's Ava. I'm a sophomore at Georgetown, Zooming in from Chicago. And my question is actually directly related to what Secretary Chertoff just addressed. So my understanding of what happened in 2016 is that Russia didn't so much hack the election as they flooded social media with misinformation that persuaded key voters. So to this point, would allocating resources towards voter education, like how to recognize false information, would that be a feasible way to increase election security? And would that have a greater, equal, or less efficacy than standard cybersecurity or social media regulation? Thank you.
A really good question. And I think maybe the answer is all of the above. I mean, I do think that giving corrective links that when there is misinformation, people can click on and flagging that. Look, some people don't want to be, they want to drink the Kool-Aid and you're not going to stop them. But for people who are genuinely trying to figure out, is this real or not? Some of the platforms are now saying, look at this. This is questionable. Click on this link. I think that's part of what we need to do. But I will say we still have to raise the general standard of cybersecurity so we don't get hacked. And I agree with Jay that we need to have deterrence. I mean, my understanding is from what I've read in the newspapers that in 2018, at one point, the U.S. government attacked the Internet Research Agency and took them offline for a few hours. And that was a troll farm that had been used in 2016 to propagate disinformation. And I think there was a message there, which is if you mess with us with disinformation, we're going to take you offline. So that's part of what a solution should be.
There's an emerging industry, if you will, of organizations. I think of one called NewsGuard that is effectively a good housekeeping seal of approval on information sources that you see on social media. The provider has to subscribe to the service, but once they do, you go on and if you see a news source, if you see a news organization, NewsGuard will indicate in some type of rating, red, yellow, green. Green is this is a news organization that has standards for truth and accuracy. Yellow means not always, and red means this is total garbage. Don't read it. We ought to see more of that kind of thing for the consumer. But again, I'm going to come back to this. We can't always count on others to spoon feed us truth and accuracy. There's a certain responsibility that we as consumers, we as members of the public, have to sort out some of the crap that we see that on its face sounds absurd. For example, my son has a friend who to this day believes that 9/11 was a government-sponsored conspiracy and doesn't really bother to apply any level of skepticism to that conclusion that he has read and that he has embraced. So one day we're sitting around the kitchen table and he's talking and my son is talking and he says, you do realize that if you think that is really true, then my dad, referring to me, has to be part of that conspiracy because it would be so vast that everybody in government, Chertoff, Johnson, and everybody since would have to be part of it. So there's a certain amount of self-scrutiny that an intelligent Georgetown University student or anybody else can apply to some of the stuff that you consume.
Okay, Ava, thanks for the question, as always. Next up, we've got Connor.
Hi, thank you for joining Secretaries Johnson and Chertoff. I'm Connor. I'm a 3L at the Georgetown University Law Center. Despite my background, I'm actually zooming in from my apartment in DC. Going along, Prime Minister Trudeau recently announced that Canada must plan and prepare for disruptions in the event, disruptions following the results of this election that might impact his citizens. My question is, after we exercise our right to vote, how should we respond proactively in the event that the loser of election night refuses to accept the result? Or how is the United States government prepared to deal with this in a manner that preserves not only our safety, but also our democracy?
Let me take two cracks at that. On the first thing I would say is there is almost certainly going to be a delay in announcing the results. And I know we're used to having the results announced 10 minutes after the polls close. We're going to have to continue to repeat over and over again to the American people, this is going to take days and even weeks, so that we inoculate people against the idea that a delay means something nefarious is going on. As to what the U.S. government can do, that's a challenging question. There are some people in the U.S. government, I won't mention names, who will try to actually promote the idea that this is a stolen election and we shouldn't accept the results. My hope is that most of the public servants who want to do their job will actually stand up for the fact that we want to give people time to count the votes, and we want to have an orderly, legal resolution of the election. We saw a little bit of that when there was that incident in Lafayette Square in June, where the military was dragooned into a photo op at St. John's Episcopal Church. And the next day, to his credit, General Milley and Secretary Esper said, you know what, we should not have done that. It was a mistake. We'll never do it again. And we have no role to play in politics. So we've got to count on every public servant's ethical and constitutional obligations.
I agree with what Mike just said. We have to assume there's going to be a delay in the result, the ability to forecast the result. It won't be 10 minutes after the polls close in a particular state. We have to prepare ourselves for that reality. And that is one of the reasons why we should all, whether it's in-person voting or mail-in voting, vote as early as possible. I've already voted here in New Jersey. Anybody who has a mail-in ballot, they should, in my judgment, fill it out and drop it off or mail it as soon as possible to ensure that your vote is counted as soon as possible in the states that permit that in advance of the election. The last thing I'll say is that in our democracy, unlike other places, someone in power does not get to retain power by surrounding themselves with the vestiges of power. No matter what, under our Constitution, the current president's authority to be president evaporates noon on January 20, 2021. That's it. Unless he is reelected with 270 electoral votes, one way or another, his power evaporates. And the person who has 270 electoral votes, the Secret Service looks at him and says, you're our president, you're our protectee, and the other guy has to walk off as a private citizen. That's the way our democracy works. That happens every 4 years. And so the test will be how we get to that result between now and January 20. There are ambiguities built into the Constitution and built into our laws about how you select electors, what happens if you don't have 270, because so much of the system depends upon mature, responsible actors to be participants in an election. And so this will likely be a test of our democracy over the next couple of weeks. But by January, I tend to believe, and the courts will probably have to get involved, that we'll have this sorted out.
I will say one thing. This is not unprecedented. We've had two prior presidential elections where there were accusations of cheating. One was when Andrew Jackson accused John Quincy Adams of a corrupt bargain, where I think he traded the vice presidency for some electoral votes. And then, of course, the Hayes-Tilden, which got resolved finally with a compromise. So we've survived some of the ambiguities, but of course, these days with social media and regular media, the velocity of emotion has really picked up.
Let's not forget, we managed to conduct a presidential election in 1944 during World War II, and we managed to conduct a presidential election in 1864 during the Civil War, when the country was literally at war with itself. And so we've done this. The unique thing about this election is that we're going to have to move somewhere between 100 million and 180 million mail-in votes, which is why it's so important to get your ballot in as soon as possible, or in states that permit it, vote in person as soon as possible.
Okay, Connor, thanks for the question. I want to try to sneak in at least one or two more. Graham.
Hello, my name is Graham Hillman. I am a freshman in the SFS, zooming in from Bethesda, Maryland. And you've both touched on at great length the responsibility that social media companies face in terms of fighting and mitigating the effects of disinformation and misinformation on the platforms they operate. And my question is, how can the government encourage cooperation from those companies in terms of carrying out that responsibility without violating freedom of speech or committing some sort of gross overreach? How do you thread that needle in terms of what the government can do to spur that on?
So that's a tough problem. When I was in office, we tried very hard to win the cooperation of social media on the issue of encryption. And a lot of these platforms were afraid to be seen as cooperating too closely with the government, with national security agencies of the government, because their consumers, their customers would see it as somehow a compromise of their privacy. I hope that at some point that climate improves, but it's a tough problem. Social media tends to want to stay away from being seen as working with the government.
So I would say two quick things. I think the government can share information and about threats, but I would be very nervous about the government getting any kind of regulation. But there are two groups that could have an impact: users and advertisers. And if they say, look, we want you guys, for example, to take hate speech off, that's not a First Amendment problem because they're private actors, but that does have impact.
Thanks for the question, Graham. And then let's go to Shelby for our last student question.
Hi, thanks again for having me. So we are currently seeing the institutional disenfranchisement of immigrants in our country, and we see very low rates of voter registration and participation among immigrants in key swing states such as Arizona. What can we do to combat voter suppression among these vulnerable demographics and build a culture that protects the rights of immigrants and people of color to vote and participate in our democracy?
You know, I saw the same statistic that you cited, and I was actually very disappointed. Both Mike and I have done dozens and dozens of naturalization ceremonies when we were in office. And the thing that always impressed me was what it took for the new citizen to get there. You know, the test that one has to take to learn separation of powers, the Constitution, to become a citizen ought to be imposed on candidates for elective office. Because many of the newly naturalized citizens we have know more about those basic constitutional principles than a lot of people who hold office right now. When I was in office my last year, we made a big push to try to discount the fees for naturalization. And we saw growing numbers of people who were naturalized, and voter registration follows almost immediately. I've been disappointed that we don't see more active levels of participation among new citizens. I hope that trend line changes.
The communities encourage their new citizens to go and vote, as was true in the civil rights movement when there were efforts to prevent African Americans from voting and to deter them from going to the polls. And you had civil rights leaders who, made clear communication to the communities: you got to get out, you got to exercise your franchise.
Okay, Shelby, thanks for the question. We're sort of at time, but if you would each just indulge me with one last question. Much of this conversation has been focused on threats and vulnerabilities of the process, but I know you both have spoken extensively and eloquently about why we shouldn't let that deter us. And so I'm wondering if you can each close with a message to those who who have fears or concerns about the integrity of our electoral process, why they should not have those fears or concerns.
It would be very difficult to defraud at scale in an election. I know there's a few people who are out there saying, oh, you can have massive fraud with mail-in ballots. It's almost impossible to do. You can affect a local town election if you wanted to manipulate it. But in order to get, swing millions of votes with fraud, you'd have to run around and collect all these ballots out of mailboxes, which is simply ridiculous. So the idea that this is going to be inherently corrupted, it ought to be dismissed as nonsense. What I would say is this: patience, and reaffirming the fact that this is the cornerstone we have to all exercise our obligation to vote and to advocate that our relatives and friends vote.
Secretary Johnson?
Yes, I'm going to repeat what I think I said at the commencement address I delivered 4 years ago for the School of Foreign Service. My grandfather grew up in the Jim Crow South. He was a sociologist. He was a black man with a PhD. And during the McCarthy era, if you were a black man with a PhD and you wrote a lot about civil rights, you were also suspected of being a communist. So my grandfather, the grandfather of the future Secretary of Homeland Security, had to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee to deny he was a member of the Communist Party, and lived his entire life in the Jim Crow South and died a second-class citizen in October 1956. 1 month before he died, he wrote an essay for the New York Times about living in the Jim Crow South. And he said that despite the situation, there is no need for despair. Faith in the strength and the code of our nation and our democracy has always been greater than the feeling of hopelessness and despair. And that's in my DNA, and I believe that my whole life, and I still believe that about our great country.
Powerful words to end on. Secretary Johnson, Secretary Chertoff, thank you both so much for spending some time. I know you're sort of doing a lot of these days. Thank you for allowing us to be part of the conversation with both of you about this important topic. And I also want to thank the members of the Georgetown community who tuned in, those students who submitted and asked questions. We appreciate your involvement. Please check out G Votes for information on voting in your community. They've got it all. They can help you figure it out. Please come up with your own voting plan so that you know how you're going to vote, when you're going to vote, all the appropriate deadlines. And join us next week. We're going to continue the conversation on Wednesday, where we will have a bipartisan panel of secretaries of state. The Democratic Secretary of State from Michigan and the Republican Secretary of State from Ohio will join us to continue the conversation about the election, and particularly with a focus on mail-in voting and why you should not fear it. So with that, Secretary Chertoff, Secretary Johnson, members of the Georgetown community, thank you all for joining us today.